Hey guys, tonight we explore why so many medieval people were afraid of the night and the imagined winter evening today. The sun dips below the horizon, and without a second thought, you flip a switch. The room floods with warm light, the refrigerator hums, and the street lamps outside cast a familiar amber glow across the pavement. For us, darkness is just a backdrop, something we easily push to the edges of our lives. But if you were to step back 600 or 700 years, sunset wasn't just the end of the workday, it was the closing of a massive, heavy iron gate. As the last purple bruises of twilight faded from the medieval sky, the world didn't just grow dark, it became absolute. The town gates were locked from the inside. Families crowded into small timber homes, barring the doors and shuttering the windows, leaving the streets completely empty. Outside, the wind rustled through the thatch, and the forest loomed like a black ocean. In that profound, suffocating stillness, the night wasn't seen as an absence of light. It was felt as a living, breathing presence, and it was terrifying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. My name is Thomas, and I want you to imagine with me a single candle trembling on a wooden table. Listen to its little inhale when the wick catches. The orange lip that spreads warm and fragile. Think of the family huddled close, faces lit in that small pool of light. A father with a rough wool cloak pulled tight, a mother smoothing a child's hair, an old woman with knotted fingers counting or humming. Outside their window, the street is a black seam, and beyond that seam the countryside breathes in deep and slow. The light in that room is not merely comfort, it is a fragile treaty against the dark. You might think fear of the night was only superstition, an old story told to children so they'd come home before curfew. But for medieval people, fear of the night threaded through every part of life. Law, religion, medicine, architecture, folklore, trade, even marriage. It shaped when markets opened and when bells tolled. It shaped what towns built and how they governed their gates. Night was an element with power, sometimes malefic, sometimes sacred, and always demanding respect. Start with the simplest thing, illumination. Before gas and electricity, before reliable oil lamps, light was scarce and uneven. A household's light depended on what it could afford. Tallow candles, rushlights made from the pith of reeds, small hearth, fires that flared hot and smoked. These sources were dim and miserable by modern standards. A single tallow candle gave off a yellow haze that could reveal only the nearest faces and bottles. It smelled of fat and soot and left the room edged in grey. A rushlight burned faster and cast a failing, watery beam. And the great hearth, though a bright eye in the room, drew all the warmth and attention, and its glow didn't carry far into corridors or across locked doors. Lighting mattered in practical ways: food prep, craft work, reading, mending. These tasks all needed daylight or a carefully conserved candle. But there was another side. When light failed, people's senses rewired, sounds amplified, shadows grew teeth. A rustle in a lane could be a thief, a wolf, a wild man, or the whispered work of spirits. Without the steady reassurance of broad, luminous space, every nighttime motion acquired the possibility of threat. But darkness did not merely hide threats, it also revealed different dangers. The cold bit harder when the sun went away. Mist curled in the hollows and turned roads into traps. Wolves and other predators used the cover to hunt livestock, and occasionally humans, preying on isolated travelers or wayward shepherds. Roads were treacherous. A traveler alone could be a day's march from help, and easily ambushed at dusk by brigands who knew the back alleys and the habits of town gates. That everyday practical vulnerability accumulated into a general mood of unease. The night was a time when normal social rules slackened, when the safety of the daytime community dissolved into dispersed pockets of light and suspicion. Religion deepened and complicated these anxieties. For medieval Christians, night carried moral and eschatological weight. The Bible was full of night images, shadows of death, the dark hour before an angel's appearance, Satan as a prowler in the night. Clergy preached about spiritual vigilance and the dangers of temptation that crept in after dusk. Monastic life, with its canonical hours, divided the night into portions. Matins, lauds, terci, each gauged to ward off slumber and inactivity. For monks, night was a battleground for the soul. For laypeople, church bells and lights reminded them of a moral geography that stretched through the dark. There was also fear of the unseen divine. People believed the night was when miracles and punishments could occur, when saints performed secret acts, or when the heavens opened with portents. Stars, comets, and eclipses were read as messages, and an unexpected shadow sliding across a town could be interpreted as God's displeasure or a demonic whisper. In a world where cause and effect often tangled with meaning, the night was fertile ground for portent and prayer. Wider cultural rituals grew from that soil. Communities set curfews, not simply as civil control, but as a spiritual safeguard. Bells rang at dusk to summon the faithful, to encourage the closing of markets and the lighting of lamps. Town watch and wardens patrolled with staves and horns, not just to ward off thieves, but to enforce a boundary between the ordered day and the dangerous night. Lantern processions, communal bonfires, and candlelit vigils became both practical safety measures and communal acts of solidarity, public demonstrations that the community would not surrender to whatever the dark hid. Then there were the stories, luminous, terrifying, and sustaining all at once. Tales circulated orally and in writing, passed from hearth to hearth, warning children and entertaining adults. These stories populated the night with figures whose logic made sense within their frames. Revenants who returned through doors that had been left unbolted, witches who flew across the roofs on broomsticks, shadowy figures who lured lost travelers into swamps, spectral hounds with burning eyes, and phantoms who repeated scenes of their violent death every midnight. Stories were instruction manuals for nighttime conduct. Do not go alone. Do not answer a knock between midnight and cockcrow. Do not let a grieving widow wander the lane after dark. Some of these narratives were localized, bound to rivers or specific lanes. In one village, there might be a tale of the grey woman, who called from the wood. In another, a warning to avoid the ford after sunset, because a man had drowned there and now sang to children. These tales had teeth because they connected to real danger, a treacherous ford, a hidden ditch, a bridge that froze. Attribution of danger to spirits or curses gave the hazards moral texture and moved people to share precautions that kept communities safer. Fear also shaped law. Many medieval statutes restricted how people behaved at night, lighting requirements, prohibitions on nocturnal gatherings, and rules about when taverns had to close. City ordinances often required households to hang lanterns, or keep fires burning in public spaces as signals and as deterrents. Some towns imposed fines for failing to properly light the doorstep, because a dark entryway invited trouble both supernatural and human. Peddlers and night workers required permits or had to travel within escorted groups. In essence, municipal law engineered light and limits to reduce the many small catastrophes the night could bring. Economics played a role too. The rhythm of markets and craft guilds meant much of life was temporarily organized. Bakers worked before dawn, fullers and tanners had shifts tied to seasonal needs. But for most, darkness was a signal to stop. Even the wealthy, while they might afford more light, still lived within the constraints of construction and supply. Candles were a commodity. Some filtered beeswax for fine church candles, while ordinary people burned animal fat. Quality and quantity of light became another marker of status, and another axis of worry. If your supply dwindled, you had to choose between mending, prayer, or preserving light for the night watch. Those small decisions mattered when the world outside was a place of extra risk. There was also practical knowledge, ways to make the night less dangerous without modern tools. People built houses with the idea of defending against the dark. Windows were small and often high. Shutters were thick and latched. Doorways had portcullises in larger towns. In rural homes, bars and wooden bolts held doors closed. Streets in market towns were sometimes roofed in arcades, so that traders could move under cover if the rain came. Inns and hospices offered safe shelter for travellers, though even inns could be risky if their owners were unscrupulous. Bridge keepers and gatekeepers earned livelihoods by tending thresholds that were themselves lines between safety and the night beyond. Yet there were contradictions. Night also held the possibility of release and romance. Lovers met in shadowed lanes. Secret oaths were taken under the cover of dark. The night could be a refuge for illicit commerce, enabling markets of goods and services that daylight propriety forbade. Think of courtesans, contraband dealers, or those seeking anonymity. Darkness could be a protection for the marginalized, a chance to slip outside the strict social gaze of the daytime. So while the night was imbued with danger, it was also a space where different social rules applied. This ambivalence extended to the supernatural imagination. The heavenly night sky, full of shimmering constellations, and the slow march of planets, inspired awe as much as fear. Sailors read the stars for navigation. Farmers watched the moon and its phases for planting. In the same breath as they prayed to keep safe from witches, people thanked God for the guidance of Orion and for the bright sign of Venus. The cosmos above the dark offered a counterbalance to the terrors that seemed to gather at ground level. One of the most striking elements of medieval night, fear, was the degree to which communities tried to control it collectively. Patrols and watchmen didn't simply protect property. They kept a moral order. A watchman's whistle could frighten away miscreants, or alert others to danger. The presence of a visible human authority reassured those sheltering behind shutters. Even where watch systems were corruptible or ineffective, the ritual of opening eyes and doors at the sound of a horn reinforced the sense that people were not entirely alone against the dark. Consider the sounds of a town at night, the creak of carts, the call of an owl, the occasional bark of a dog. Dogs served a vital role. They were early sensors, reacting to sounds before humans could name them. Farmers relied on them for warning. Urban households kept them to alert, and sometimes to aggress the intrusive. Yet dogs could only do so much against a world that preferred to hide. The night itself remained a diffuse opponent. Medical knowledge of the period also colored the fear. Night was associated with ailments that made sense in pre-modern frameworks. The miasma of evening, when damp and cold brought fevers and coughs. The idea that nocturnal influences could alter humors. The fear of nocturnal emission as a moral and physical concern. Physicians and barber surgeons recommended warm bedding, hot spices, and other means to fortify the body against the night. Herbs were carried as talismans. People slept with garlic or rosemary for protection. Such practices served both physical and psychological ends. They comforted and slowed the combustive imagination. Witchcraft and magic became perhaps the most potent narrative engines of nocturnal dread. Across Europe, from the British Isles to the German lands, accusations of witchcraft often picked up at night. There was the image of witches riding to Sabbaths, secret gatherings in the woods, where the ordinary moral order was inverted. These tales fused older pagan ideas with Christian demonology. For ordinary folk, a neighbour's odd habits, an ill-luckful birth, or a cow gone dry, could be read as evidence that someone had been with the dark. Punishments and trials followed. Sometimes entire communities turned inward, sniffing for the source of their anxieties. That process itself made nights more fraught, because suspicion encouraged furtive behaviour, and furtiveness invited rumour. The legal dimension of witchcraft, witch trials, inquisitions, and confessions extracted under duress, stitched together a terrifying logic. The night was a time for secret compacts, and secret compacts could lead to harm. Those ideas reached their most grotesque scales in the later medieval and early modern periods. But their roots lie deep in the medieval anxiety about nighttime as the sphere of hidden malevolent agency. Another thread worth noting is the role of urban planning in mitigating the night. Medieval cities were compact, often built within defensive walls, which made the night both more contained and more claustrophobic. Narrow lanes funneled sound and sight. Tall buildings cast long, heavy shadows that seemed to swallow whole sections of town. At the same time, walls and gates allowed for regulation, locks could be fastened, and watchmen could be stationed. In open rural areas, the night seemed boundless, while walls made the danger more concentrated. The trade-off was stark. Towns offered organized protection with intense social surveillance, while the countryside offered freedom with greater exposure. The psychology of group identity mattered here too. Townspeople were often anxious about outsiders at night. The peddler with a heavy pack, the traveling player, the stranger seeking lodgings. Those individuals might bring news, goods, or art, and yet they also embodied unpredictable elements. The suspicion attached to strangers at night was often rational. They could be spies, thieves, or carriers of disease, but it also fed cultural narratives that would interpret the unknown as morally suspect. Then there were natural phenomena that without modern understanding became omens. Nocturnal animals' behavior, crows gathering, foxes hunting, could be read as signs of weather or worse. Eclipses produced panic. Meteors were messages. Thunderstorms at night were doubly terrifying because the flashes revealed an instant of violent light, followed by engulfing dark. People fashioned rituals, prayers, candlelight processions, exorcisms, to keep the cosmos aligned with their safety. These rituals were both communal and practical, giving people something to do in the face of unfathomable forces. The ritual of sleep itself carried rules: where to place the bed, whether to leave a small light burning, how to orient a child's cradle, who should sleep near a pregnant woman. These practices mixed superstition with hard-won caution. For example, midwives and neighbors might insist that a door be barred against night visitors on the eve of a birth. Such precautions were stories embedded in survival techniques. They taught the next generation how to move through the night with more confidence. Look at the architecture of a manor or castle, and you'll see preparations for the night. Strong keep doors, guard towers to watch the surrounding dark, deep cellars, where grain could be kept safe. Noble households maintained night guards not to exercise princely privilege, but because they had goods and lives to protect. Even kings worried about night. Courtly romance also loved the night. The secret lover under a balcony, the moonlit journey. But that too existed within the same frame of danger and desire. Beyond the borders of Christian Europe, similar anxieties took other shapes. In parts of the Islamic world during the medieval centuries, for instance, night was also a liminal time layered with spiritual significance. Sufi poets wrote about the night as a time of inner revelation, while urban laws regulated nocturnal commerce and movement. In the Byzantine East, the division between sacred hours and profane night produced its own rhythms. Across cultures, the night demanded rules, yet not every culture feared the night in the same way. Some peoples developed cosmologies that incorporated darkness differently, sometimes seeing it as a fertile field for dreams and prophecy, rather than purely as a menace. But in medieval Europe, our focus to night, dangerous, sacred, and social meanings of the night converged to shape a powerful cultural attitude. Stories from court records and household accounts give us vivid, human details. A certain 14th century Londoner's diary might note, in laconic terms, that on Michaelmas night a woman cried that her child had been stolen. The watch found only boot marks and a stray chicken. Or a rural parish register would record how a man returning late from a fair was set upon and robbed near the ford. These are small notes, often overlooked, but they build a mosaic of lived fear, practical, petty, and ominous. There are also the literary depictions, which show how authors wrestled with night's meaning. Chaucer's pilgrims travel through dusk and encounter tales of the supernatural. Romances stage moonlit encounters that are both thrilling and dangerous. The poets and storytellers of the period didn't present a single message. They shaped a canvas where night could be beautiful, treacherous, salvific, or damned. That variety suggests medieval people held complex feelings. Fear was not the only response. smell becomes more distinct. The cool, damp air seems to press against the skin. When people spoke of the night, they often invoked these sensory shifts. A chronicler might describe how, after a strange thunderstorm, the air smelled of brimstone and neighbours suspected a witch, or in a pastoral tale, a shepherd might hear the distant bray of a donkey and imagine a troop of furies descending. These sensory cues were the raw materials of belief, and they filled the hours after sunset with texture and meaning. Let us pause with an image. A lane outside a village, a strip of cold moonlit thatch, and a lone woman carrying a small brazier to the well. Her breath clouds in the air, she knows the route, she's made it 1,000 times. But tonight, there's a new sound, a far-off footfall that doesn't belong. She tightens her cloak, counts her steps, and crosses the road as if she were stepping over a threshold into daylight. She is not foolish, she is prudent. Her caution is a language she learned from elders, from law, from prayers, from stories. In towns, the market bells signaled the end of commerce and the start of a different kind of economy, one of watching and counting and keeping. Candle sellers would close their stalls, and householders check their stores. Some households left lights in the windows as beacons for wayfaring kin, or to show the night's watch that the household was awake and vigilant. The smallest actions, placing a coal near the door, leaning a broom against a shutter, were part practical and part symbolic. They were commitments to resist the dark. Consider how people counted time at night. Without artificial light, time's rhythm altered. Night stretched longer in winter and shorter in summer, and people adjusted sleep patterns accordingly. The polyphasic sleep pattern, long sleep interrupted by a period of wakefulness, has been suggested by historians for pre-industrial societies. Those waking hours in the middle of the night were sometimes the most fertile for superstition. A quiet time when the imagination stirred, when small noises multiplied into narrative. Couples might converse, prayers might be said, and some might use the quiet for secret work. But it was during such hours that the night felt most like an entity, waiting, listening, perhaps even acting. The legal records we mentioned earlier include ordinances about beggars and vagrants at night. Cities often established refuges for the poor to prevent them from wandering in the dark. Yet fear of the night could harden into cruelty. Accusations that a person had been wandering at night unsupervised might be used to brand them as suspicious, or to justify harsher penalties. Being out late became a social signifier. It suggested bad company, moral looseness, or desperate need. Law thus transformed night into both a practical and moral category that disciplined bodies and controlled space. Religion added layers of ritual to the domestic handling of night. Households sometimes invoked saints before bed, leaving out food or small offerings to ensure protection. There were apotropaic objects, holy medals, blessed salt, or scratched crosses over lintels, signs that the household was actively engaging in spiritual defense. The medieval mind was comfortable mixing the practical with the sacred. A salted dish and a whispered prayer could coexist as complementary forms of protection. In some regions, the church formalized responses to the night with institutional presence. Nightly masses and vigils before important feast days created a liturgical counter, ritual to the general anxiety. The spectacle of candles held high during processionals was not just religious theatre, it was a communal assertion that light and faith could hold space against the darker possibilities. Night also shaped moral allegory. Sermons used nocturnal imagery to teach ethics. Staying awake was often equated with spiritual vigilance, staying asleep with sin. Those metaphors had real social consequences. Employers who expected laborers to be alert at night might frame it as a moral duty. Parents warned children that laziness could lead to neglect and vulnerability. Over time, These moralizations knitted themselves into the material practices of towns. What of the natural sciences of the period? Astronomy, to the extent it was practiced, gave people tools for prediction, calendars, phases, and the movements of planets. Yet meteorology was crude. People observed atmospheric signs, a red sky at night, a sudden chill, and used these to anticipate weather. Such predictions could be life-saving, but often they were probabilistic and uneven, so people maintained rituals of precaution for when the predictions failed. That conservative attitude produced an infrastructure of habit: close the shutters, store firewood, keep the animals near. The most intimate and persistent fears associated with the night are those tied to the life cycle: birth, illness, death. Night was the time when births often occurred without a physician's steady hand, when fevers rose, when the dying succumbed. Death itself was framed by nocturnal symbolism. Wakes held through the night, candles burned, and the soul's passage was imagined as a crossing from light into darkness, or for the damned, into an even deeper night. The vigil over the dying was a human confrontation with night's metaphors. It was a practice that yielded rituals, prayers, holy oils, and the company of kin that were both practical and profoundly emotional. Travel narratives highlight another aspect: pilgrims on the road at night. Pilgrimage was a medieval mainstay, and pilgrims confronted the night as a test. They slept in hostels, in churches, sometimes beneath the stars. The night could be a purification, a trial, or an opportunity for transformation. Pilgrims' tales that include nocturnal danger, robbers on lonely roads, misdirection in bogs, or the comforting light of a sacred shrine in the dark, remind us that night was entwined with spiritual journeys as well as physical peril. Look at the economic consequences more closely. Night limited work, and therefore constrained production. Crafts that could be done by candlelight were often high-value, specialized tasks: manuscript illumination, small metalwork, or delicate sewing. The scarcity of light meant that many activities remained seasonal. Harvest and harvest-related tasks were organized to avoid unnecessary night work. This shaped labor rhythms across the year, and, by extension, social rhythms of celebration and rest. The body's response to the night must be reckoned with too. Circadian rhythms existed even if people didn't name them. People slept longer in winter, shorter in summer. Illnesses that flared at night were often read as supernatural attacks, because the day offered no pattern for them. A fever that rose after sunset could be seen as an assault by malign spirits. Remedies were mixtures of empirical and ritual: hot baths, heated plasters, charms, prayers. These matters of health added gravity to the nightly fear. Across centuries, the perception of night shifted gradually as technologies and institutions developed. Street lighting campaigns in later medieval cities, the growth of professional watch forces, and the increasing availability of better candles, like beeswax for wealthier households, softened the edge. But these changes were slow and uneven, and the cultural memory of night as danger remained stubbornly present. We should also acknowledge how class and gender colored nocturnal experience. Men who fought, managed, or traveled faced particular risks, and they were expected to take them. Women, especially those with care responsibilities, negotiated the night differently, guarding children, managing hearths, and enforcing household barriers. The elderly and the infirm were vulnerable in ways young men were not, and their night stories are often quieter, but no less intense. Social status influenced light access, but vulnerability to the night permeated nearly every level of society. Then there were the extraordinary events that amplified fear: plagues that spread under cover of night, rebellions that erupted at dusk, fires that consumed whole quarters when embers caught in thatched roofs. The Great Fire of London came much later, but its medieval predecessors show how a single spark in the night could cascade into catastrophe. Town ordinances about thatch, about refuse, and about hearth maintenance were all responses to the knowledge that darkness concealed danger and made rapid disaster possible. We must not forget the sensory poetry of the night: the soft, creaking oak, the whisper of the river, the owl's lonely call. For many, Fear and beauty dwelt in the same pulse. Poets and mystics used the metaphor of the night to explore longing, divine absence, or contemplative solitude. Night prayer could be exquisite, a body and soul attentive to small sounds, to the rustle of a candle, to a neighbor breathing. The same space that held wolves and thieves also held deep tenderness and devotion. Even the economic underside of night, criminal economies, had its own logic. Thieves organized to exploit darkness. Gangs knew which lanes were unlit, which gates poorly barred, which travelers likely to carry coins. Communities responded with innovation, lockable chests, stronger bolts, and neighborhood packs to escort vulnerable members. Such adaptations slowly reduced some nocturnal harms, though never entirely. The medieval imagination also produced hybrids, figures who embodied night's paradoxes. The night watchman was both protector and suspicious authority. The ferryman, who moved souls across watery boundaries at night, could be a helper or a trickster. These archetypes told moral lessons about trust, vigilance, and the thin line between help and harm. In the end, fear of the night was not a single fear, but a tangle of practical worries, spiritual anxieties, social controls, and poetic images. It was a lived anthropology. People made meaning, took precautions, told stories, and organized their lives around dusk, to dawn patterns that modern readers may find strange. Yet in many ways, these patterns were sensible responses to a world where darkness truly changed the risks of living. Imagine, now, an inn on a winter's night. A fireplace roars in the common room, cider steams, and 3 travelers huddle at a table exchanging tales. One is a merchant with a narrow accent and a heavy satchel. One is a young squire with a cracked helm. The third, older, has eyes that have known towns of many tongues. A rain thunders on the roof. At the window, a shadow passes. The innkeeper draws the bolt. The fire is trimmed deliberately. Too much light may warm but will invite attention. Too little and the travelers cannot read the map that matters. Decisions like that, how much light, whom to trust, when to sleep, are minute policy debates about risk. And in the countryside, a watch differs. A small village appoints a group to walk in rotation, carrying torches and ringing a bell to announce the hour. They check for open gates, for cattle lost, for travelers in need. Their authority is local, their enforcement sometimes casual, sometimes strict. The bell marks a civic rhythm that reassures people in bed that someone remains awake in the world beyond their shutters. Over time, the imagery of threats in the night became more inflated and formalized. Tales of night, flying creatures and midnight assemblies found Inquisition records, are 2 sides of the same coin. One is oral imagination, the other is institutional panic. The 2 reinforced each other. As tales grew more sensational, authorities responded with harsher measures. As authorities cracked down, whispers multiplied to fill the gaps left by official silence. It is essential, as we move forward, to notice how these elements braided together: material scarcity, sensory experience, religious meaning, social structure, law, and narrative imagination. None by itself explains the medieval fear of night. It was the combination, the way each facet amplified the others, that created an environment where dusk could close like an iron gate. I want you to follow with me into a single evening to taste these dynamics in motion. Picture a family in a small walled market town somewhere in England around the late 1300s. The town has a market square, narrow lanes, a wooden bridge, and a single church with a modest steeple. The town gates close at sunset by ordinance. The watchman will make his rounds. The family keeps 3 tallow candles and a brazier in the corner of the main room. They have a barred door and shutters fastened with iron pins. The head of the household returned earlier that day from the market, with a small bag of salt, some mending thread, and a note that a cousin has come to town and needs lodging. As dusk thickens, the family prepares. They set a pot of soup over the ember, move the table toward the hearth, and gather their children. The eldest daughter checks the shutters while the mother smooths the baby's blanket. In the lane the bell begins to toll. A watchman prods his lance into the gutter, calls the hour, and the town shutters close one by one like eyelids. The family breathes in the familiar rituals. They know the watchman and the sound of his call. They know which window faces the path where travellers might pass. Their actions are automatic, a choreography of survival. Then there is an interruption, a knock at the gate. A soft, anxious knock, conversations at the table still. The father glances toward the door, listening. The knock repeats, uncertain and insistent. The daughter whispers for the father to peer through the little hatch. A face appears in the hole. A young woman, soaked, eyes rimmed red, asking for shelter. In daylight, this might be a simple matter of charity. At night, it is a fraught decision. The man weighs the risk. An open door invites thieves or worse. He opens and allows her across the threshold. Inside, the woman speaks hurriedly. She fled a quarrel. She had been followed. She is hungry. The household takes her in, but they add cautious measures. A neighbour stays alert by the hearth. Doors are latched extra tight. The man slips his knife into a visible place and sits by the door. The woman sleeps in a corner, watched. No one says the word, but the night has encoded self-protection into every gesture. At some point, around the second watch, when people speak in lower tones and the fire is banked for longer burning, a sound emerges, a low, distant howl from beyond the town walls. The children stir, the mother murmurs a prayer, and the father tosses another piece of peat on the fire. The howl is a reminder that the world outside the gates is alive with other actors, other appetites. For some in the room, it stirs memory of lost sheep, of a cousin who was robbed on the road. For others, the howl becomes a living metaphor for the force of the night. In that inn or household, stories circulate to make sense of what has happened. The soaked woman may be later accused in rumour as complicit in a theft, or she may be defended as an unfortunate soul rescued by mercy. Either path shows how nights mattered not only for immediate safety, but for reputations. Being associated with nocturnal scandal could ruin a life. That is social pressure shaped by darkness. We follow a different night now, that of a watchman named Giles, a civic official in a well-fed market town in northern France. Giles is middle-aged, his hearing keen, his knees stiff from years of trudging the lanes. He knows the names of the innkeepers and the regulars at the bridge. His wooden staff is worn smooth where his palm has gripped it for years. He takes pride in his role because he believes in its efficacy. A sound sleep for his neighbours means his work was well done. For him, the night offers both responsibility and solitude. Giles makes rounds with his partner. They move from the gate toward the market square, passing under low eaves. They stop at the mill to see if the miller left the sluice secure. They check the gatehouse, listen for the distant clip of travellers, and scratch at shutters that are poorly latched. They are practiced in reading the night. An open window signals possible mischief. A light left burning in an alley suggests someone ill or simply careless. Their job is partly detective work, partly performance. By being visible, they claim the night for civic order. Yet even for watchmen, the night can be corrosive. Watchmen sometimes looked the other way, accepted bribes, or even joined night raiding parties. That undermining of trust made the community fear the night in another register. The possibility that those meant to protect were part of the problem. That fear cut both ways and is visible in court records, where watchmen appear as suspects or as witnesses called to explain their lapses. At a larger scale, imagine a borderland night where soldiers patrol near a contested frontier. Their fear carries the weight of political stakes. A nocturnal raid might topple lordly authority, or signal the start of larger conflict. For soldiers, nighttime was training ground for stealth and terror. Orders to watch, to patrol, to be suspicious were part of their daily life. The night could be a tool of war, surprise attacks, raids, sabotage. Medieval warfare often exploited dusk because it disoriented defenders and allowed for concealment. The deliberate use of night as strategy further cemented its association with peril. Our sense of night's danger must also accommodate joy and rhythm. Consider nocturnal festivals. Like certain saints' days where processions wound through dark streets lit by many candles. Those nights were both celebration and communal affirmation against the ordinary fear. By gathering in numbers, by creating spectacles of light, people reclaimed the night, if temporarily from its usual association with threat. These moments remind us that fear was flexible, and that ritual could reconfigure night's meaning. Now, let's turn to a single pivotal historical case that crystallized many of these themes. In the early 14th century, in a mid-sized German town, a series of nocturnal thefts sparked panic. Livestock disappeared, barns were slashed, and strange marks were found at thresholds, charred bits of cloth, odd footprints. Rumor swelled into theory. Perhaps it was a gang, perhaps a hired thief, perhaps a curse. The townspeople organized night patrols, inspected the gates, and held councils of elders. They also consulted clerics, seeking spiritual counsel. The priests suggested prayers and an all-night vigil. A local woman, already marginalized for her temper and lack of kin, was accused by neighbors of meeting with strangers at night to bargain. The accusation spiraled into a trial that included confession under duress and punishment. There are familiar threads here: material loss, anxiety, rumor, communal action, legal response, and the scapegoating of vulnerable people. But note how the night functions as both cause and amplifier. The crimes occurred at night, making investigation hard. The lack of visibility allowed suspicion to fill in the blanks. The communal response was both defensive and moralizing. The vulnerable inhabitant, often a woman whose life lay on the edge of respectability, found herself in the center of a narrative that tied her to darkness itself. The outcome, sometimes deadly, demonstrates how fear of the night could be weaponized to reorder social relations. We can also explore the role of technology in changing night practices. The introduction of better candles, beeswax, for instance, offered cleaner, brighter, longer, lasting light. Candles were expensive. Oil lamps smoked. Infrastructure depended on wealth, and the poor found their nights longer and more perilous. Hence, social stratification shaped nocturnal experience. The greater your means, the more you could buy light. The poorer you were, the more you negotiated darkness. At the same time, growing urban centers in the later medieval period experimented with formal lighting. Regulations requiring well-lit streets near markets or along important routes began to appear. These policies were acts of municipal modernity, attempts to domesticate the night by making it legible, lit, and governed. The fact that such policies were necessary shows how deeply night had been an unregulated terrain of fear. Equally important were the metaphors that night supplied to medieval thinkers. Darkness as moral lapse, night as the wilderness of the soul, and night as the realm of hidden sins appeared in sermons, chronicles, and private letters. These metaphors shaped behavior. The more night was equated with the morally suspect, the more people policed nocturnal behavior. In a feedback loop, policing reinforced the idea that the night needed policing. We can also trace a more benign lineage, the contemplative attraction to night. Mystics often sought nighttime solitude to encounter the divine. The quiet, the lack of daytime clamor, and the star-strewn sky offered conditions for introspection. For those drawn to prayer, night was a canvas for revelation. This voice of night, soft, searching, and hopeful, ran counter to the more pervasive voice of fear. It suggests that medieval attitudes toward night were plural, and that some people found a kind of spiritual richness in the dark. As history moves forward, we see that night's power waxed and waned with social change. But in the medieval centuries, the darkness maintained a hold precisely because so many forces, material scarcity, ecological threat, juridical control, spiritual cosmology, and narrative imagination converged. That convergence produced a culture where locking gates and ringing bells were not mere routines, but the everyday choreography of safety. Let us close this segment with a slow, lingering image, a moonless night over the moors. The air smells of peat and distant sea. A single figure walks between farms, a bundle against the rain, a hood drawn tight. She can make out the silhouette of her own town in the distance, a scatter of faint lights. Each step is a negotiation with sound, with memory, with the knowledge that the night can offer cover and also threat. She moves quickly, counting the rhythm of her footfalls as if they were beads. When she reaches the gate, the warder unbolts it with a scrape that sounds enormous in the stillness. Inside, she exhales. The night remains outside, but within the walls, by the light of a small candle, people will make stories and hold each other close. The gate is iron, but the real defense is the human practice of caring and watching. And yet the night is not done with us. There are nights where gates fail, where watchmen sleep, where storms scatter ashes, and where rumor takes on life. In the next stretch of our journey, we'll follow the specific threads of how witchcraft accusations, legal structures, and evolving technology turned the fear of night into profound social transformations. We'll look at particular trials, ecclesiastical pronouncements, and the slow creep of municipal lighting policies that began to alter the nocturnal landscape. For now, breathe with me. Notice the soft rhythm of your own room, and imagine the small, stubborn acts that medieval people took each night to claim a little more safety against the dark. We will continue by stepping into one of those recorded trials. A case that begins with a midnight scream and unfurls into a courtroom drama that reveals much about belief and power in the darkness. Thomas paused at the threshold of that story, and then stepped back in, softly, the way one leans close to listen to someone telling something dangerous and private. The scream, when it first cut through the town, was a thin, high thing, more like the crack of a twig underfoot than the roar you might expect. It came from a narrow lane off the market square, where the lamps were unreliable, and the houses leaned toward each other like gossiping neighbors. People woke, blinked, and some rose, drawn by the sound like moths to a candle. Lamps were lit hastily, doors were pushed open. By the time the watchman arrived, a small crowd had gathered, and a woman's voice, choked and rattled, described a theft that was also a violation, a child taken, a house rifled, and a mark burned into the threshold. The legal proceedings that followed were not merely about property. They were about ordering the night itself. The magistrates summoned witnesses, neighbors, the watchmen, the householders whose lamps had been visible that night. They cited ordinances about the closing of gates and the obligation of watchmen to patrol certain alleys. They asked whether the brazier had been kept lit, who was seen moving about, whether any strangers had been noticed near the ford at dusk. In theory, these were ordinary municipal questions, but in practice, the absence of clear evidence made a roomful of men and women flail toward meaning memory, which is easy to reconstruct when nerves are raw, filled blanks with narrative. One of the first witnesses claimed to have seen a shadow slip along a back wall. Not a man, the witness insisted, but a shape that moved like a man yet had a crooked gait, as if it limped in two directions. Another swore that when she stepped outside to call for help, she felt a cold breath at her neck, as if an animal had brushed past. Such testimony, earnest and bewildered, was freighted with symbolic weight. A community that lived by visual cues found its senses fraying in the night, and the courtroom became a place to make public the private terror of darkness. The accused in this case was a woman named Alice, not wealthy, known to some as a healer because she'd tended wounds and brewed salves. To others, she was strange because she kept to herself and had no husband. In that town, such figures were precariously balanced between neighborly utility and suspicion. When someone could not account for a misfortune, when a child vanished or a herd sickened, people looked for proximate causes. A healer's knowledge of herbs and human bodies was both useful and a convenient scapegoat. In the hush of the courtroom, her occupation became evidence not of skill, but of secret contrivance. Under cross-examination, neighbors trotted out small facts. She walked at odd hours. She left burning herbs at thresholds. She had once muttered about being wronged by the reeve. These details stitched together into a narrative of nocturnal conspiracy. The magistrates, constrained by the standards of their legal system, but influenced by communal fear, accepted some of this testimony as credible. The pressure on Alice increased. In some cases like this, confessions were wrung from the accused under various conditions: threat, hope of mercy, or the simple terror of hearing the town turn as one against you. Confessions in such contexts are never straightforward windows into truth. They are performances shaped by pain, coercion, and the desire for an end to torment. What is instructive about this trial is less the verdict itself than the way night supplied the scaffolding for guilt. The legal system held nominally neutral procedures, yet those procedures were practiced inside a culture that already understood darkness as a domain where misdeeds multiplied. The absence of clear, observable evidence made people rely on narrative logic. They searched for intention, for motive, for a pattern that would explain the unexplained. In the absence of light, stories did the work light could not. When we look at these moments closely, what we see is a law that is porous and social, not strictly technical. Magistrates did not operate as neutral machines. They were neighbors who had eaten the same bread, been frightened by the same howls, and inherited the same superstitions. Their decisions had to balance communal anxiety with the practical need to maintain order. Sentences sometimes aimed to be deterrent, public punishments, fines, or forms of social exclusion. In this way, law became a way of rebinding the community's sense of safety, by showing that night would not be allowed to dissolve social boundaries without consequences. The judicial focus on nocturnal acts also reveals something about medieval evidence. Sound, scent, and partial sight counted. Witnesses were often asked about the quality of noises, the smell of smoke, or the silhouette outside a shutter. Because modern standards of forensic proof were absent, narrative coherence mattered more than empirical verification. A convincing tale could therefore tilt a trial. That reliance made legal spaces secondary theatres for the drama of night. The story of Alice ends, in its recorded form, with exile rather than execution, forced to leave the town, and perhaps to seek shelter under more merciful skies. But even exile functioned as a communal remedy. It removed a suspected source of nocturnal unease. In exile, Alice's fate spread into other towns, carrying rumors that could poison interaction elsewhere. The social geography of night fears therefore extended beyond a single town, rippling outward as people migrated or told tales. Night's terrors became portable. Beyond individual trials, ecclesiastical authorities played a central role in shaping how communities understood nocturnal peril. Bishops and parish priests preached about guarding the soul at night. They counseled on penance, on amending slothful habits, and on the dangers of gossiping in the dark. The church also provided practical resources. Monasteries offered shelter to wayfarers, and clergy sometimes served on night watches during crises. Yet at the same time the church was a vector for belief in witchcraft and demonic activity. Sermons that equated the dark with temptation and sin made moral policing during nighttime an ecclesiastical imperative. That interplay between spiritual authority and civic responsibility mattered. When a priest linked a spate of nighttime misfortune to demonic influence, lay authorities sometimes felt legitimized in escalating punitive measures. Confessions extracted by ecclesiastical courts could feed secular punishments, so the line between spiritual counsel and civic enforcement blurred, particularly in moments of panic. We should also trace how narratives about night entered printed culture. From the late medieval period onward, as pamphlets and chronicles circulated more widely, stories of nocturnal horrors gained broader audiences. The printing press would later accelerate this trend, but even before that, itinerant storytellers and copied manuscripts spread tales from town to town. A particularly lurid account of a house beset by nocturnal apparitions, say, or a village stricken by a midnight blaze, could become part of a regional repertoire of cautionary tales. Those stories did more than entertain. They provided templates for interpreting new events. When a strange sound occurred, a listener could recall a printed saga and read the present through the lens of the familiar tale. Culture thus accumulated a library of nocturnal motifs that primed people to see and say certain things. At the same time, not all nocturnal phenomena were fearsome. There were, as I mentioned before, nights of vigil and festive procession, where the town deliberately made night a place of light and song. These public enactments were, in many ways, a cultural counterattack on the dark processions of light, particularly during epidemics or after disasters, were meant to draw the community together and to create a sacral force that repelled the malign. They were performative safety, a renewal of communal bonds through shared ritual. People stood shoulder to shoulder bearing candles, singing, and in that act of synchronized vulnerability found protection. Such communal strategies had limits. In the face of widespread threats, plague, war, famine, the night became layered with new anxieties. An epidemic transformed ordinary nocturnal practices. Homes became places of quarantine. Doors were latched more strictly, and strangers were shunned. Night's danger shifted from predators to contagion. Paradoxically, the same darkness that had once been a cover for rogues and wolves became an ally to disease. This added another dimension of fear. The night could hide both human malice and anonymous biological threat. If we step back for a moment and think of the psychological landscape, it's clear that the human mind responds to uncertainty by filling gaps. The medieval mind, like any mind, used cultural tools, stories, legal forms, religious practices to reduce uncertainty. The cumulative effect of those tools, however, was to create a culture where nocturnal uncertainty was not merely minimized, but given moral and supernatural form. In other words, darkness was made to mean something, and that meaning shaped behavior in durable ways. Now, move with me to a coastal town where the night is a different animal altogether. Salt air, gull cries even at night, and the rolling of small boats created a backdrop where nocturnal danger included drowning, shipwreck, and piracy. Mariners placed particular stock in lighthouses, though true modern lighthouses were rare. Instead, towers with fires or beacons served as vital nighttime markers. For sailors, the night was a test of seamanship. The trade-off between pressing on under moonlight to meet tide windows and seeking safe harbor at dusk was a calculated risk. Mariners told tales of ghost ships and phantom crews, and those stories served both to entertain and to teach caution. In coastal communities, the night's fear was frequently maritime and practical. A negotiation with tides, weather, and the moral economy of smuggling. Smuggling itself thrived in darkness. Where legitimate trade was taxed and regulated, markets arose in shadowy coves and unlit paths. Smugglers took advantage of the night's cover, and coastal settlements often lived in a complicated relationship with them. On the one hand, smuggling brought wealth. On the other, it invited violence and lawlessness. Town officials might turn a blind eye when a contraband ship bought local goods cheap. Yet the presence of unlawful night commerce could make other townspeople more anxious and prompt stronger regulations, patrols, and community organizing. These economic dynamics produce morally grey social spaces where repeated nocturnal activity normalized behaviors that daylight authorities condemned. Over time, those tensions fed into political debates about who controlled the night and how. Wealthy merchants concerned about theft invested in security. Local lords asserted night patrols, commoners improvised survival strategies. The contest over nocturnal order was a microcosm of broader struggles about authority. We can observe similar tension in monasteries, which were rarely isolated from nocturnal fear. Monks kept vigil hours and lit their own candles in specific patterns, but monasteries also served as sanctuaries during times of night violence. People fled to cloisters, trusting the sanctity of religious walls to protect them from thieves or worse. Monastic rules prescribed schedules that turned night into a disciplined time. In turning the night into a structured practice, prayer, reading, sleep, the monastery represented a micro-society that harnessed darkness for spiritual ends. That harnessing was not immune to outside fear, but it offered an alternative model, discipline rather than panic. The medieval night was also a theatre of political theatre. Rulers manipulated darkness strategically. A nighttime gathering could be a site of conspiracy. Courts met in the dark of night to plan coups. Towns sometimes staged illuminations to display loyalty or celebration, and those displays were messages to neighbors and rivals. The control or display of light could be a form of power. Whoever controlled the torch could, in a public way, claim moral and practical authority over a space. Another layer to this is the role of children and oral education. Parents taught their children night protocols through stories and admonitions. Do not answer a knock between midnight and dawn. A mother might say, do not climb the hedge at night. These admonitions were more than mere control, they were life skills. When children grew into adults who knew streets by the way, the moon hit a chimney, they carried forward practical knowledge that mitigated risk. Oral culture transmitted survival tactics as well as superstition, and that transmission was an essential component of communal resilience. Medical practices at night sometimes asked practical miracle of the body. Surgeons might be called at odd hours to staunch bleeding, or deliver aid during births, often in poor lighting. Those calls were occasions of improvised expertise, the flickering shadow of a surgeon's hand, the smell of pitch, the careful hold of a midwife. In such moments, the night could be both tender and terrible, the place where life was saved and where it was lost. Midwives and healers, despite the suspicion they sometimes drew, were crucial actors in these nocturnal dramas, functioning as the human interface between the living body's needs and the environmental risks of darkness. It is useful, too, to track the symbolic uses of night in literature. The night as disguise in romances, the night as test in pilgrim tales, the night as crucible in saints' lives. Literary conventions don't simply reflect fear, they shape it. When a troubadour placed a lover's rendezvous at midnight, audiences understood both the romance and its danger. When a hagiography described a saint wrestling in prayer through the night, listeners took it as a model of moral stamina. Narrative forms and cultural anxieties therefore reinforced each other. As we move toward later medieval centuries, we observe incremental technological changes that began to change the equation. Improved street architecture, more organized watch systems. Fear is not a machine that shuts down the moment one adds lanterns. It is an accretion of stories, experiences and laws that balance on each other. So even towns lit by improved lamps retained rituals and narratives that treated night as dangerous. Let's return for a moment to the human scale, because that is where these histories matter most. Consider a widow living near the river who keeps a small lamp burning at her doorway because her old husband once drowned on a foggy night returning from market. That lamp is more than practical, it is memory made habit. It emits a faint, stubborn challenge to the dark. Or think of a child who sleeps lightly because neighbors once told of a spectre that called names outside the window. These little domestic facts are the scaffolding of a culture's nocturnal experience. They are not grand legal or ecclesiastical policies, but they are the brickwork of daily life. And yet the night resisted being fully domesticated. Storms scattered thatch, gates failed, watchmen fell ill. In those moments, the darkness asserted itself with a cruel patience. People responded with improvisation, neighbor patrols, sharing of candles, or sending children to safer households. Solidarity practices emerged as much from necessity as from compassion. That solidarity, often fragile, we come then to the cusp of a larger transition. As municipal authorities slowly took on more responsibility for lighting, and as technologies incrementally improved, the nocturnal landscape altered. But the cultural meanings of darkness did not evaporate overnight. Instead, they transmuted, finding new outlets in literature, in legal reforms, and occasionally in collective hysterias that found fresh targets for the age-old fear of the night. As we continue, we will trace how those transformations play out in a series of emblematic episodes: a notorious witch trial that hinged on nocturnal gatherings, an urban ordinance that tried to mandate lanterns along a river road, and a pastoral account of a shepherd who misread stars and paid for it. Each of these vignettes will show how the medieval night was negotiated, contested, and slowly, sometimes painfully, reimagined. For now, hold the image of the courtroom one more time. The scratch of quills, the candle smoke making halos around the magistrates, the hush when an accusation is made. Hear the undercurrent, the town's need to impose structure on a time that refused easy oversight. That need has shaped countless decisions about who could cross thresholds, who could be trusted at dusk, and how communities ensured themselves against the unknown. We walk next into a different kind of nocturnal scene, a great household manor, where the nighttime orders of the Lord reach into servants' lives, and where the night can be a theatre for both generosity and cruelty. The steward calls for men to stand watch at the gate. The Lord keeps a private chamber, lit by beeswax candles. The cooks bank the hearth to save coals. In such houses, the power structure extends into nocturnal regulation. Servants might be punished for leaving a door unlatched. They might also be favoured if they perform well as guardians in the dark. The manor's control of the night is an extension of the Lord's authority, and it crystallizes how power operates in the intimate hours. There are nights when that power is contested. A group of servants might slip out to meet lovers. A forest-dwelling outsider might try to steal stock. A political rival might test the manor's defenses. Those nights erupt into conflict that can become violent. The manor must enforce order, but its means, punishment, fines, or labor echo the broader social stakes. The night thus becomes a proving ground of lordship and subordination. And there are nights of religious performativity within the manor too. Masses said at midnight for special occasions, candles lit along the chapel aisles, the sound of a bell that calls the household to prayer. Those rituals show how power could also be stabilizing and sanctifying, binding servants and masters together through shared religious practice. In doing so, the manor contributed to cultural norms about night, that it was a time for watchfulness, for moral instruction, and for the reinforcement of social hierarchies. As we keep moving through these scenes, it becomes clear that nocturnal life in the medieval world was a complex mosaic, threaded with fear, but also with care, ritual, authority, and adaptation. People did not simply cower from the dark. They organized themselves around it, learned to live with it, and developed strategies that were material and symbolic, legal and poetic. The night stories, some true, some exaggerated, drop like feathers into the morning. For many, the relief of daylight is visceral. For others, the work of repairing what the night broke begins. In a few hours, markets will open, gossip will spread, and the town will forget some of the night's terror, though it will remember enough to keep shutters and laws in place. There is one more thread we must follow, a quieter one, the role of dreams. Dream culture in medieval times was a serious matter. A bad dream could be treated as an omen, urging increased vigilance. People who dreamed of wolves or dark water might act differently at dusk. Dream interpreters, clerics or learned men might be consulted, and their guidance could alter behavior. The porous boundaries between waking fear and dream. Anxiety made the night operate on multiple registers simultaneously. And so with that, we do not close the book, but turn the page. Ahead lie specific episodes that crystallize the strands we've touched: witch trials, municipal reforms, and the slow technological march that began to reconfigure how medieval people experienced darkness. In the next section, we will step into one of the most famous witch trials that began with a midnight ring of bells and a rumor of secret aerial gatherings. And we will listen to how testimony formed, how fear metastasized, and how institutions responded in ways that reshaped community life. For now, let the image of a single candle linger, its warm, uncertain light, its small circle of safety, and the vast unknown beyond. Keep breathing, and allow the quiet to settle. The next night we enter will be more intense, an episode where rumor and law collide, and we will watch how the dark behaves when pressed between human voices and official power. For now, let the image of a single candle linger, its warm, uncertain light, its small circle of safety, and the vast unknown beyond. Keep breathing, and allow the quiet to settle. The next night we enter will be more intense, an episode where rumor and law collide, and we will watch how the dark behaves when pressed between human voices and official power. That trial began with bells, the kind that pierce sleep and gather people in the square. One bell sounded for a theft, another for a summons, a third for a curfew breach, until the many voices of the town assembled in the market, like a flock startled into shape. The accused were not all strangers. They were neighbors, women who brewed salves and men who mended shoes, the occasional itinerant with a pack, and a few youths who passed through the town at odd hours. The charges, at first modest suspicion of collusion in the thefts, failure to heed the watch, swelled into allegations of nocturnal conspiracy. Names were said aloud, and with each name the town seemed to constrict like a fist. The sense of danger that made people speak so readily had many roots. Stories of the missing child and the ransacked hayloft had circulated like smoke. The details had shifted with each telling. The missing child might be snatched by a shadow, or by a man with iron eyes. The ransacked hayloft might have been slashed by wolves, or cut by human hands. Uncertainty breeds narratives that fit known patterns, and here the pattern was darkness as intentional force. Once that interpretive frame took hold, the town's legal apparatus, its reeve, its alderman, its priest, began to funnel the diffuse fear into a series of formal inquiries. Interrogations in this era often feel alien to modern sensibilities, because they mix domestic conversation with coercive practice. Questioning took place in candlelit rooms, where every cough and shift of paper could be read as an admission or deflection. Interrogators asked what seemed like common-sense questions. Where were you at dusk? Who else knew you were out? Did you see anything unusual? But the context colored those questions. To say you had been out late without good reason could mark you as careless. In one hearing, a man named Hughes testified that he had seen a group of figures at the riverbank a week prior, their faces covered by hoods, carrying bundles that might have been sacks or might have been something else. Hughes's voice trembled when he described the figures. He insisted he had been alone, that he had returned home because the sight had made his chest tight. The magistrate asked if Hughes could swear on the altar. He did. But oath-taking was not a magic rod for truth. People swore to what they believed, and belief itself was molded by fear. When a town rehearsed the idea that nocturnal groups met to conspire, witnesses began to see such groups everywhere. Rumor is a curious engine. It amplifies facts and fills gaps. An overheard argument at dusk could be retold as a midnight conclave. A rival's late-night visit becomes evidence of sedition. Material traces, charred cloth, hoof marks, a child's toy, acquire sinister biographies in the retelling. He court-served as a communal interpreter, and the outcome of interpretation had real consequences. Punishments ranged from fines to public penance, exile, or corporal punishments. The law, which ideally wanted clear evidence, often settled instead for order achieved through visible sanctions. The spectacle of judgment, the public humiliation of the accused, was itself a technology of deterrence. By making an example, the town aimed to reassert control overnight. As the trial widened, so did the narrative space for witchcraft accusations. A few months earlier, there had been a widely circulated account, thin and breathless, of a meeting in a copse where women were said to have traded charms and conspired to damage a lord's harvest. That tale had been told in taverns and at market stalls, until it became hard to separate its earliest kernel from later elaborations. When accused people testified, questions about nocturnal meetings and the use of charms surfaced naturally. Words like Sabbath and pact began to enter the record, but they meant different things to different people. For some, they suggested diabolical intent. For others, they could be the hyperbolic language of rumor. It is worth pausing on the ambivalence of charmcraft. In many villages, folk healers were indispensable. They set broken bones, soothed fevers, and contrived poultices that worked, sometimes by luck and sometimes by careful observation. But those very practices involved knowledge deemed suspect by orthodox authorities, herb names, ritual phrases, little rituals at thresholds. If a healer used a charm successfully, neighbors were grateful. If the next week their child fell sick, that same healer might be suspected of causing harm. The line between cure and curse was fragile and mediated by social relations. In law, this translated into a precariousness for those whose livelihood depended on nocturnal visits. Midwives, healers, and other liminal figures whose work placed them inside people's private hours. Confessions in this milieu often had to be coaxed. Sometimes accused persons, under the strain of imprisonment, hunger, and the weight of communal opprobrium, confessed to acts that matched the town's anxieties. The dynamics of familiar isolation produces compliance. Repetition of expected scripts makes people believe their own words, and the desire for relief can outweigh concerns about truth. A confession that detailed nocturnal flights or pacts with demonic figures might be less a report of real events than a composite of local motifs and interrogators' suggestions. Yet courts took such confessions as powerful evidence and proceeded accordingly. These processes had gendered dimensions. Women were disproportionately represented among those accused in nocturnal conspiracies. That is not to say men were immune. There were always male suspects. But the social logic of suspicion often targeted women who lived marginally, widows without male protection, women who kept to themselves, or those who had disputes with neighbors. Medieval social norms prescribed behavioral parameters more stringently for women, and deviations from those norms, nocturnal wandering, vocal independence, or speculative commerce, could be interpreted as signs of deviance. Such patterns of accusation reveal how fear of night overlapped with mechanisms to police gendered behavior. To understand how violence could escalate from rumor to penal action, we should also look at the role of ecclesiastical courts. Clergy sometimes emphasized the spiritual dangers of nocturnal assemblies. When priests told congregations that the devil could exploit the night to seduce souls, their words were not neutral abstractions. For parishioners living on the edge of subsistence, such sermons converted anxieties into moral narratives with clear villains. In some regions, ecclesiastical courts pursued cases of maleficium, harm done by magical means, leading to penances or excommunication. Where civil and ecclesiastical jurisdictions overlapped, coordination between church and town could sharpen the punitive potential. But let's not imagine a simple chain from fear to condemnation. Many communities exhibited a range of responses. Some resisted hasty judgments. Others called for more measured investigations. And in some cases, neighbors rallied to defend the accused. Social capital mattered. If a healer had tended 100 neighbors and had known friends among the local elite, those bonds could protect her. Conversely, social isolation left people exposed. Communities were, in many ways, networks of reciprocal obligation, and accusations of nocturnal wrongdoing could either fracture or consolidate those networks, depending on how leaders responded. Beyond courts and pitches of rumor, the practicalities of evidence collection in darkness deserve attention. No physical forensic science existed, but people used what they had: footprints, displaced stones, marks on hearths, skilled observers, millers who knew the weight of sacks by the sound, or shepherds who knew the gait of a local gelding, could provide testimony that carried weight. Yet these observations were subjective and susceptible to misinterpretation. A footprint might be from an animal, not a human. A scorch might be from cooking, not a ritual. The probabilistic quality of evidence in nocturnal contexts meant that decisions were made on balances of plausibility rather than mathematical certainties. The town's sense of time also shaped how evidence was understood. Dusk and dawn are transitions. Actions taken in those liminal hours became culturally charged. Someone seen at dusk could be a market trader returning home, or a conspirator leaving for sinister business. Liminality breeds suspicion because it defies the neat categories, day and night, safe and unsafe, through which people structure moral judgment. At the core of this trial, and others like it, was a question of authority, who could define what was normal at night, and who could judge deviations. Towns had mechanisms, ordinances, watchmen, and magistrates to enforce patterns. But when events exceeded these mechanisms' capacities, external authorities, bishops, itinerant judges, or even regional lords, were sometimes called in, their arrival could either impose stricter measures or cool the crowd, depending on their temperament and interest. The involvement of higher authorities often meant that decisions would have consequences beyond the immediate town, setting precedents that influenced neighboring places. The historical trajectory of such trials informs us about changing political structures. As centralized powers strengthened in some regions, they sought to regulate nocturnal activities more uniformly. The Crown's interest in preventing nocturnal disorder had fiscal and political rationales: property protected, taxes collected, and rebellious elements contained. So what begins as local fear can be absorbed into broader programs of state-building night regulation then becomes another facet of governance. That said, the human cost of these processes was real. Exile tore families apart. Public shaming could curtail prospects of marriage or employment. Corporal punishment left bodies scarred. The legal mechanics of punishing nocturnal offences were meant to deter, yet they often punished the weak in ways that compounded suffering. We must put names to these tragedies: the widow forced to leave town, the healer whose pots were smashed, the boy who was flogged, because the night's policy outcomes had concrete material effects on lives. And yet there were nights when courts and communities acted more humanely. Instances of restorative justice, compensation paid, apologies rendered, communal feasts to heal rifts, also occurred. Where people recognized the flimsy nature of evidence, where kinship networks intervened, and where leadership practiced restraint, the night could be navigated without catastrophe. These variations remind us that medieval responses to nocturnal fear were not predetermined. They were contingent and responsive to local culture and leadership. What emerges, if we examine the texture of these episodes, is a picture of the night as a contested moral theatre. It was a place where authority, rumour, and community practices overlapped and sometimes clashed. From the small quarrel at a threshold to the larger civic ordinances, the night shaped and was shaped by human action. Fear, practical mitigation, and social imagination all braided together. Let us step now into a different setting to taste how these dynamics operate under different pressures. A border fortress on a cold night during a season of political unrest. In such places, night is a strategic asset for both defenders and attackers. Lookouts in towers scanned moonlit fields, scouts crept along hedgerows, watchkeepers signaled one another with fires or horns. The night could conceal troop movements, giving smaller forces tactical chances, but it also obscured friend from foe, and fear of infiltration bred routines of inspection, double-checking, and sometimes paranoia. Orders specified how gates should be watched, which sentries were to be relieved, and where pits or palisades needed reinforcing. Beyond immediate military concerns, border societies developed particular cultural responses to nocturnal threat. People married differently, built differently, and stored goods differently. The presence of constant threat altered rhythms of life. Children taught to recognize the sound of cavalry, markets timed to avoid ambush windows, and communal watches that were more formal and disciplined. These adaptations show how the night could become institutionalized into a region's social structure. And yet, even in such hardened places, rumor and fear remained social technologies. A single nighttime alarm, perhaps raised mistakenly, could trigger a chain reaction. Men arming, livestock driven to shelter, doors smashed. Several recorded accounts show how panic on watch led to tragic self-inflicted losses, fires started in haste, deadly stampedes, or executions of suspected intruders, later found to be false. That kind of error is instructive because it shows the double-edged nature of night vigilance. The very systems designed to protect can sometimes be the instruments of harm when misreadings occur. We should be careful not to romanticize the past as a time of unrelenting fear. There was humor too, witty barbs about nocturnal exploits, songs about watchmen dozing at their posts, and jokes traded among travelers reveal that people could treat their anxieties lightly. Humor is a practical human response to anxiety. It diffuses and makes bearable. Taverns echoed with bawdy songs that imagined the night as a place of misadventure, and those songs functioned as both entertainment and social admonition. As we progress chronologically, the late medieval period introduces new kinds of records that help us see these nocturnal practices in sharper relief. Account books showing expenditures on lanterns, ordinances prescribing placement of lamps near certain bridges, and letters complaining about thieves who struck at dusk. These documents are prosaic, but telling. They demonstrate that municipal responses to nocturnal fear were material, money spent on light, nails and watchmen, and that communities considered these investments necessary for social stability. Another angle worth following is the philosophical and theological interpretations of night. Thinkers debated whether darkness was a privation of light, an absence, or something with its own properties. Augustine, for instance, had reflections on night as both a metaphor for sin and a time for soul-searching. Later medieval theologians wrestled with metaphors drawn from nocturnal imagery, spiritual blindness, the dark night of the soul, and the promise of dawn. These intellectual treatments shaped sermons and domestic imaginings. The night was therefore a philosophical and spiritual category, as well as a daily hazard. We might also examine the nocturnal economy of knowledge. Scholars who needed quiet for reading often rose during the second night watch to study, and their lanterns in cloistered studies were places where the night became generative rather than solely fearful. This cultural pattern, where night could be both a menace and a resource, underscored a broader truth. The night's meaning was negotiated by different social actors with different needs. For a miller, the night is a time for sleeping and guarding. For a scholar, it is a time of study. For a watchman, a domain of duty. So by now we've mapped several registers of nocturnal life: legal, ecclesiastical, domestic, economic, military, and intellectual. Each register had its own instruments: laws, prayers, shutters, lanterns, pikes, and books, that together formed a culture's response to darkness. When those instruments failed or were misapplied, fear erupted into violence. When they functioned well, people managed the night with a sense of routine and resilience. Now, let's move into a more intimate nocturnal scene, one that reveals how personal relationships were shaped by darkness. Picture a clandestine meeting under a willow near a river. Two lovers, forbidden by family ties or social rank, choose the night because its cover grants them anonymity. Their meeting is charged with both desire and risk. If discovered, they face scandal. If discovered on a highway, they might be assaulted. The night becomes a character in their story, a collaborator and threat. For such lovers, the night offers a space where other social rules relax, where new alliances can be formed, and where the body's wants can find expression outside daytime scrutiny. These subversive nocturnal uses underscore a central paradox. The night is both liberating and precarious. It shelters acts that daylight would forbid, enabling both tender transgression and dangerous clandestine activity. This duality explains why authorities often tried to monitor nightlife, to control those liberatory spaces where social order could be challenged. As we fold these strands together, a pattern emerges. The medieval fear of night was not monolithic, it was a mosaic of specific practices and beliefs that coexisted and competed. Fear had practical logic, wolves, brigands, falling roofs, but it was also entangled with moral judgment, religious cosmology, and social power. The night, in short, was a theatre where physical danger, cultural imagination, and political authority intersected. Before we go further, let's linger with a single emblematic evening, in which many of the themes we've discussed converge. It is a chill, moonless winter night, in a riverine market town, where trade creaks like a machine slowing for the cold. A fire has recently been reported in a neighbouring village, and rumours say it was set as an act of malice. The bridge that brings travellers to market is under suspicion. Merchants, already anxious about their goods, are particularly watchful. The town council calls an emergency meeting and orders extra patrols. Beacons are lit at strategic points. The priest instructs households to keep candles in windows and to pray the psalms. In that town, a woman named Bretta, who sells fine linens, discovers one of her chest locks tampered with at midnight. She calls for help, lights a brazier, and the watch responds. A youth is seen sneaking away from the quay, laden with a sack that might be stolen cloth. He is chased, apprehended, and brought before the magistrate at dawn. Under questioning, his story unravels. He insists he had been bribed by a traveller who had promised gold for midnight assistance. The traveller, denied on his story, claims he was at an inn. Witnesses contradict each other. The town is in a fever. In the end, the youth confesses to stealing with others in a nocturnal ring. Whether the confession reflects the entire truth is open to doubt, but the public outcome is decisive: punishment, restitution, and a renewed watch. This vignette contains many pieces: suspicion about a bridge, a merchant's lost goods, a watch system in motion, a confession obtained under pressure, and a communal sense that order has been restored. It is a microcosm of how medieval communities negotiated night. A breach, real or suspected, triggered a familiar choreography: alarm, investigation, confession, sanction. Each step reinforced the narrative that the night had to be policed. But such episodes also belied improvisation and mercy. In several recorded examples, towns didn't simply punish, they also redistributed risk. Neighbours invited one another's children to sleep in safety, they pooled funds to pay for extra lanterns, or they petitioned lords for resources. Those acts of mutual aid were as much a part of nocturnal culture as enforcement. The town was not merely an authority structure, it was a web of people who cared for one another in concrete ways. That web softened some of the sharp edges of the night. As the medieval period progressed, new pressures and possibilities emerged. The growth of trade meant more people on the move at all hours. The slow improvement in lighting technologies made certain nocturnal activities easier, and political centralization began to regularize police functions. Yet these transformations did not instantaneously erase the old nocturnal imaginaries. Instead, they layered new patterns onto old fears. The result was a rich, shifting tapestry of night, life that varied regionally and socially. One last, delicate point. The language used to describe the night mattered. Poets, preachers, and storytellers shaped the lexicon. Phrases like the dark hour, cockcrow, and the witching time of night had emotional force. Language both reflected and produced attitudes. To call a place uncanny is to mark it as morally and emotionally unsettled. The vocabulary of night, therefore, acted as a cultural instrument, informing how people perceived and acted toward nocturnal spaces. In the next portion of our journey, we will linger on the technology of light itself and trace how innovations, materials. We have walked long through many kinds of nights: courtroom nights, watchman's nights, manor nights, lovers' nights, and nights thick with rumor. Each scene shows different textures of fear and care, different mechanisms for managing darkness, and different outcomes for those caught in the margins. What remains constant is the human attempt to render the night legible through law, ritual, architecture, and story. Manufacturing processes and municipal policies slowly remade the experience of darkness. We'll follow the practical details, how beeswax candles were traded, how oil lamps were maintained, how lantern design changed, and how towns invested in public lighting. Those concrete things, wicks, wax, and iron, played an outsized role in the history of fear, because they altered what was touchable and visible in the night. For now, breathe a little deeper, and picture the town we've been in. The watchman's staff leaning by the door, the brazier's sleepy glow, the lingering scent of burnt tallow. Listen for the far-off tolling that marks the passing of hours, and know that the story is not yet finished. The night still holds more transformations and surprises we will explore together. Those concrete things, wicks, wax, and iron, played an outsized role in the history of fear, because they altered what was touchable and visible in the night. For now, breathe a little deeper, and picture the town we've been in. The watchman's staff leaning by the door, the brazier's sleepy glow, the lingering scent of burnt tallow. Listen for the far-off tolling that marks the passing of hours, and know that the story is not yet finished. The night still holds more transformations and surprises we will explore together. Light in the medieval world was never simply about illumination. It was about meaning and choice. Whether a household burned a single tallow candle, or a church consumed pounds of beeswax, that decision encoded priorities of piety, status, and risk management. Was expensive. Churches and wealthy households used it for both aesthetic and ritual reasons. The glow of a beeswax taper in a chapel had a clarity and steadiness that ordinary people rarely experienced at home. For a parish, affording sacramental light was a way to assert dignity and divine favor. For the poor, however, tallow, made from animal fat, was the common alternative. It smoked, it stank at times, and it yielded a dimmer, flickering light, but it was accessible. That discrepancy in lighting quality reinforced class distinctions in how night felt. Beyond wax-type, wick technologies mattered. A well-trimmed wick burned cleaner and offered a steadier light. Housewives and hearth keepers learned the craft of trimming, of banking embers to last the night, and of preserving small, precious cubes of wax. Those domestic skills were essential. When candles were scarce, people rationed them carefully, one for an ill child through the night. Oil lamps, where available, offered an alternative. In parts of the Mediterranean and in urban centers with trade links to the east, lamps fueled by olive oil or other oils burned with a cleaner light than tallow. But oil was also an expensive commodity and required storage and maintenance. Lamps needed wicks, and the vessels themselves had to be kept free of soot and residue. The technology of lamps and the commerce around oils thus shaped nocturnal regimes, ports and merchant towns that could access oil. Lead lighting had different night cultures than inland villages dependent on animal fat. Lantern design evolved too. Early lanterns were simple, wood frames with oiled cloth sides. But as metalworking improved, iron and brass lanterns became more common among those who could afford them. A sturdy lantern could be carried along a muddy lane, protecting the flame from wind and rain for watchmen and travelers. This mattered. A lantern also had symbolic power. Carrying a lantern into a dark alley signaled civic presence. Towns sometimes required innkeepers to keep lanterns at particular posts by order, making lanterns quasi-public infrastructure. Trade in lighting materials was a whole economic universe. Candle makers, chandlers, formed guilds in many towns. They regulated quality, controlled pricing, and maintained standards for what counted as acceptable light. The guilds also shaped ritual life. They provided livery for processions, supplied candles for guild chapels, and sometimes controlled the pipe supply of wax to churches. Where the chandler's guild was strong, the nighttime economy was somewhat more ordered. Where it was weak or absent, supply fluctuated and households improvised. Municipal policies followed naturally. Some towns passed ordinances obliging residents to hang lanterns at night outside their front doors during market days, or to keep public thoroughfares lit. These rules were sometimes motivated by practicalities, reduce theft, aid wayfinding, but also by symbolic governance. A town that enforced light was a town that asserted control over its nocturnal geography. There are records of fines levied against households that failed to hang lanterns, or against taverns that warned their patrons to go out into the dark without a torch. The imposition of light thus became part of civic order, yet the distribution of light remained unequal. Poorer neighborhoods, often near riverbanks or on the fringes outside the protective walls, tended to be darker. That darkness correlated with higher rates of night crime and with greater exposure to natural danger, flooding for instance, which could make rivers burst their banks at night when watchers were fewer. In that sense, night exacerbated existing social inequalities. The less you could afford to light your lane, the more dangerous it became. The technology of lighting intersected with other technological and architectural strategies for managing the night. Streets were sometimes narrowed and roofed with arcades to protect pedestrians from rain and to concentrate light. Stone paving reduced mud and made signs more visible in dim conditions. Gatehouses and towers were repaired and strengthened to control ingress at dusk. In towns situated on hills, the placement of beacons on higher ground created sight lines that extended a sense of human presence into the surrounding dark. A particularly interesting innovation was the development of watch houses and small guardrooms at strategic points. These spaces served multiple functions: storage for pikes, shelter for watchmen, and locations where charcoal or small fires could be maintained to provide local illumination. When we imagine the medieval night, it's helpful to think of it as a patchwork of bright islands and deep channels of shadow, where each island, an inn, a church, a watch house, had its own rules and rhythms. Religious institutions had a direct role in lighting policy too. Brotherhoods and confraternities sometimes dedicated funds to poor households, specifically, so that those households could keep a candle lit on feast days or for specific devotions. Such acts were both pious and practical. They reinforced communal bonds and extended a network of light beyond the reach of municipal investments. Confraternities also staged special public illuminations during processions, deploying hundreds of candles in a visual assertion against night fear. We must also consider the role of industrial actors, the smiths, the coopers, the carpenters, whose work intersected with nocturnal economies. A well-made door, iron bolts, and reinforced shutters were as vital as lanterns. Armorers and smiths produced not only weapons, but also iron staples and hinges that improved household security. In that sense, darkness spurred artisanry. The need to secure night compelled technical problem solving in metallurgy and carpentry. The effective side of lighting is worth pausing on. Light produced a certain emotional climate. The steady tapers in a chapel offered consolation and continuity. A bright hearth put people at ease. A single candle in a threshold signaled welcome and comfort. Conversely, a sudden extinguishing, wind snuffing out a flame, a candle tipping over, could produce an immediate anxiety. Fire itself was a double-edged phenomenon. It produced warmth and light, but it could also consume houses. The risk of nocturnal fire-shaped behavior. People banked hearths at night, kept water nearby, and constructed watch schedules when large, thin thatch-roofed areas were close together. Grain storage is another area where night and light intersected. Granaries held a community's wealth, and keeping them secure at night mattered. Watchmen patrolled fields and barns. Farmers kept animals near the house when nights were dangerous. Communities established watch rotas at key times, such as harvest or post-harvest seasons when theft was likelier. The tactile labor of stacking sheaves, bartering in secrecy under dim lamps, and guarding against night time theft forms a rhythm that tied the economy to nocturnal practice. Shift now to the nocturnal life of craftsmen, scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders, who often worked by lamplight in workshops. For them, the night could be productive. Scribes copying texts needed steady light and a quiet atmosphere, and monasteries or urban workshops sometimes offered both. The medieval book production economy thus depended on the availability of reliable light in specific spaces. Scribes were paid for their labor, which was often time-consuming and required fine vision. These artisans developed routines. They trimmed wicks with little snips, set up leather on wooden frames to absorb smoke, and calibrated their lamps to burn evenly for long tasks. Here, the night was a resource rather than merely a hazard, an occasion for focused labor that produced long-term cultural goods. We should also notice how nighttime intersected with law enforcement beyond watch systems. The magistrate's ability to adjudicate nocturnal offences often depended on reporting and quick action. In some towns, magistrates instituted citizen rounds, where certain trustworthy townspeople were obliged to report suspicious nighttime activity. These systems had complex social implications. They could be used to target rivals, but they also created a sense of mutual duty. Over time, formal police functions evolved from these civic obligations, but the medieval prototypes illustrate how communities collectively wrestled with darkness. Cultural practices around night also included an aesthetics of sound. Bells had temporal authority. Church bells used for curfew itself coming from couvre, feu, or cover fire, regulated when fires should be banked. The sound of bells was a temporal anchor. People attuned their activities to their tolling. Horns and whistles served as alarm systems. Songs and laments might be sung at vigils. Soundscape management, using auditory signals to coordinate nocturnal behavior. We shouldn't overlook economic incentives to keep the night safer. Merchants and guilds pressed for improved lighting because secure nights reduced theft and increased market reliability. When such groups petitioned local authorities for better lamps or stronger gates, they framed their arguments in terms of commerce and civic benefit. The economic power of these petitions often determined which neighborhoods received infrastructure investments. Wealth concentrated lighting improvements in certain places, which in turn reinforced economic advantages. The relationship between nocturnal practice and medical beliefs is subtle but strong. Physicians recommended specific practices for night to prevent humoral imbalance, wrapping up warmly to guard against night air, avoiding wet clothing that could invite chill, and taking certain broths before sleep. Nighttime maladies were interpreted through the humoral system. Cold and damp of the night could imbalance the body's humors, inviting fevers or melancholia. Preventative practices, keeping feet warm, sleeping near a hearth, were both physical protections and psychological comforts. Sleep itself was a technology. Beds were often communal in poorer households, and sleeping in shifts, where different family members took watches, was common. The concept of first sleep and second sleep. The idea that people slept in two phases with a period of subdued wakefulness in between offers intriguing insight into medieval nocturnal rhythm. That middle period, when the household stilled yet some people remained awake, was a time for prayer, for quiet conversation, for chores that couldn't be done in daylight, and ironically, a time when imagination ran wild. People might pray, make notes, attend to ailing children, or whisper secrets. The cultural practice of segmented sleep shaped how people experienced fear. The second sleep could be frayed by uneasy dreams, and the first sleep's end could awaken people to fresh anxieties about the day. Let's look at how night shaped public health responses in crises. During outbreaks of disease, nights became sites of quarantine. Houses with infected members were shut, and watchmen ensured no one left. Communities struggled with the balance between compassion and containment. Night enforcement, through watchmen and seals on doors, served both to prevent disease spread and to stigmatize infected people. The emotional weight of such nights, where families were isolated under the hush of candles, left deep marks in oral memory and in the chronicles. There is also an important cross-cultural dimension. In Iberia, Jewish and Muslim communities had their nocturnal practices that differed and yet intersected with Christian norms. In Jewish communities, Ritual lighting of Sabbath candles changed nocturnal timetables. For Muslims, the night prayer of Isha and the special Taraweeh prayers during Ramadan structured nocturnal rhythms. These practices created plural nocturnal geographies within medieval towns, where different communities negotiated shared streets and markets under varying rules about night. The co-presence of distinct liturgical timetables added complexity. The same hour could be sacred for one group and secular for another, and that overlay shaped interpersonal relations and municipal regulation. Now consider the nocturnal life of itinerant performers, minstrels, acrobats, and traveling players, who brought lightness and entertainment to the night. Taverns and market squares were their stages. Their performances often lasted late into the evening, drawing crowds that blurred social boundaries. These nocturnal entertainments could be judged morally suspect by some, yet they provided vital social functions. They brought news, they spread songs and stories, and they offered release from daily toil. Night, in these contexts, was not just regulated time. It was a cultural marketplace for communal joy and tension relief. We must also track the symbolic uses of nocturnal creatures in shaping fear. The owl as omen, the fox as trickster, the wolf as predator. Folklore attached moral lessons to these animals. The sounds they made at night were interpreted as warnings or portents. People learned to read the night's fauna as part of a diagnostic system. An unusual congregation of crows might presage a storm. A wolf's howl near the edge of town could signal a missing lamb. These interpretations were pragmatic as well as metaphorical. They guided decisions about tending stock, closing gates, and staying close to shelter. Consider also the role of the night in legal testimony. Witnesses who claimed to have dreamt of a crime sometimes had those dreams taken seriously as evidence of guilt or innocence. The boundary between dream and waking testimony was porous. Dream accounts were woven into narratives of spiritual and social causality. In some cases, dreams provided the first sparks of suspicion that later became full-blown accusations. That interplay shows how medieval epistemologies, ways of knowing, integrated subjective experiences, like dreams, into communal adjudication. Architecture responded to all these pressures. Towns rebuilt along more defensible alignments. Houses were constructed with smaller windows and internally lit courtyards. Watchtowers were placed at vantage points. Even ecclesiastical spaces were designed with nocturnal concerns. Churches with permanent lamps before altars, or bell towers that gave orders to the sleeping town. The built environment thus recorded the city's nocturnal priorities. As technology evolved, so did the aesthetics of night. Candlelight's flicker influenced artistic representations. Miniatures and manuscript illuminations took into account how light plays off surfaces. Artists who painted nocturnal scenes had to capture the interplay of glow and shadow, and their images shaped how readers imagined night. These visual cultures reinforced the nocturnal imagination. A page illuminated by gold leaf, or a painting showing a saint's face aglow in the dark taught viewers how to visualize sacred light. By this point in our journey, we see that negotiating the night required a multiplicity of tools: physical, social, spiritual, and technological. Each tool had limits and costs. Candles went out, watchmen slept, bolts failed. Human ingenuity, however, created layers of defense that made many nights tolerable. Where ingenuity failed, improvisation and community support often filled the gaps. That resilience is as central to the medieval night as fear itself. Our understanding deepens when we attend to particular voices. The woman who kept a lantern for the entire lane, the minor official who recorded watch payments in a grim hand, the monk who rose for matins with fingers stiff from cold, and the child who learned to identify the sound of the river by night. These microhistories reveal how the large themes of law, religion, economy, and technology were lived day by day. Night by night, they also show that fear was not a homogeneous cloud, but a series of precise worries addressed with specific solutions. There were also moments when the night was celebrated for its beauty. Poets praised moonlight, lovers arranged secret rendezvous, shepherds sang under the stars. These practices remind us that darkness had aesthetic and emotional value. Sometimes, the night provided a canvas for wonder, for reflection, and for human intimacy. It is tempting to emphasize danger because it is dramatic, but to do so exclusively would miss the full range of nocturnal life. Before we move toward a concluding sequence that will show how these medieval practices set the stage for later changes, let's dwell on one final nocturnal vignette. A small scene that condenses many strands. Imagine a river town on a still summer night. The ferry glides back and forth, lanterns hanging from its ribs. A widow awaits her husband's return from a late market. A watchman leans against the parapet, his lantern guttering in a mild breeze. In the gloomy distance, a procession of travelers approaches with torches, their shadows painting the houses. The widow sees her husband's silhouette, hurries down, and together they cross the bridge into the warm air of home. Inside, a child calls for milk, and the hearth is banked for the night. The watchman notes the time in his log and moves on. It is a simple sequence of trust, vigilance, and recovery. This small tableau shows how the night was made workable by routine, by the distribution of light, and by human care. People organized their nights with a mix of ritual and pragmatism. They lit, locked, watched, and comforted one another. Fear was present, but it was not unrelieved. Communities found ways to make night an inhabitable, if never wholly safe, realm. As we prepare to close this fourth section of our journey, remember the many instruments, candles, lanterns, watch, houses, legal ordinances, guild regulations, charms, prayers, that communities used to negotiate the night. Each instrument carried meaning and cost, each shaped behavior, and together they formed the medieval nocturnal order, imperfect, contested, but durable. In the final part of our story, we'll trace the arc into later centuries, how improving technologies, changing legal frameworks, and new cultural attitudes began to remake night. We'll follow how light itself became entangled in urban planning, colonial expansion, and industrial rhythm. We'll see how some fears subsided while others transformed, and how the medieval relationship to darkness left legacies that persisted long after tallow candles flickered out in urban workshops. But before we go into that last chapter, sit with the image of the widow and the watchman for a moment. Hear the steady note of their small, mundane bravery, the rhythm of practices that do not make history on banners, but make it in the daily act of holding a lantern steady for someone else. Those quiet acts, more than any grand ordinance, kept people alive through the long medieval night. When you're ready, we'll step into the transformations that reconfigured nocturnal life and discover how the modern night was gradually made. But before we step into those later transformations, let's hold the widow and the watchman in our minds a little longer. Their small acts, lighting, watching, opening a door, are the everyday scaffolding on which larger institutional changes will build. When new ideas or technologies arrived, they did so into a world already thick with nocturnal habits. Innovations did not replace rituals overnight. They layered over them, altered them, and sometimes contradicted them. That layering is what makes the last stretch of this story so interesting. It is not a clear arc from darkness to light, but a long negotiation in which light, law, and culture reconfigure one another in slow, surprising ways. A key driver of change was economic growth. As towns grew and trade intensified, more people lived and worked close together. Dense urban fabrics made some aspects of the night more dangerous, fires for instance, but they also made public lighting more cost-effective. When a street served many shops and workshops, the argument for investing in lanterns and more permanent lighting structures became stronger. Merchant associations sometimes funded street lamps because their profit margins depended on safer nights. In that sense, commercial logic became a lever to transform nocturnal life. Another driver was technological know-how. Improvements in metallurgy and glass, making slowly improved lantern quality. Better glass reduced wind's effect on flame and allowed lanterns to shine steadier and brighter. The development of improved wick materials and the gradual expansion of markets for cleaner oils also contributed. These technological advances were gradual and uneven. Some towns leapfrogged into better lighting because of geography or wealth, while others remained in the older regimes of tallow and rushlight. Yet the cumulative effect, over decades and centuries, was to reduce the darkness monopoly on perception. As lighting technologies spread, municipal policy-making adapted. Town councils instituted ordinances, not only requiring lanterns, but also creating budgets for maintenance. Watch systems professionalized in some places, paid watchmen, regulated patrol routes, and basic reporting requirements became more common. The medieval watch, originally a patchwork of citizens' obligations and ad hoc rotations, began slowly to resemble organized municipal policing. That shift reshaped social relations. Citizens once responsible for each other's safety found new expectations placed on salaried officials. The psychological effect was meaningful. People could delegate some night anxieties to designated authorities, which reduced the burden of constant personal vigilance. Yet as institutional responsibility increased, so too did anxieties about surveillance. A curious reversal occurred. The light that made nights safer also made them more visible. Lanterns cast shadows that exposed both criminals and private lovers. Watchmen with better lighting could see deeper into alleys. Some residents feared the loss of privacy, others cheered the reduction in anonymous nocturnal crime. That tension, between the desire for safety and the desire for anonymity, echoes in later debates about street lighting and surveillance. The medieval moment that began the process is a reminder that technological improvement often carries trade-offs. The cultural imagination shifted as well. As nights gradually became less uniformly perilous in urban centers, the symbolic weight of darkness evolved. Literary imaginations adapted. Late medieval and early modern plays and poems explore night as a setting for intrigue, but also as a time for civic gatherings, night markets and theatre. The night becomes a stage for a wider variety of human activity. That enrichment of nocturnal imagery did not eliminate fear, but it diversified the night's associations. The interplay with religion also changed. The Church's grip on nocturnal rituals loosened in some ways, as lay confraternities and municipal bodies took on responsibilities for processions and lighting. Yet spiritual rituals persisted. Votive lights burned in chapels and at shrines, and nocturnal processions remained important. The persistence of these rituals suggests that even as civic structures evolved, the spiritual meaning of light as ward against darkness retained its cultural potency. Colonial expansion and the globalizing medieval world added yet more complexity. When European traders and settlers encountered other cultures, they also carried their nocturnal habits and anxieties. Some colonial towns prioritized lighting and watch systems as a means of asserting control over foreign spaces at night. Conversely, they encountered indigenous night practices that were different in rhythm and meaning. Some cultures had cosmologies that embraced night as a time for different social activities, for prophecy, or for communal rites. These cross-cultural encounters sometimes produced conflicts, but they also generated exchanges of practice. The medieval night, as it spread with people and goods, acquired new layers of meaning. As we move into early modernity, other forces push change. The rise of centralized state power, improvements in public administration, and the growth of market economies. Central authorities began to invest in infrastructure that included lighting and roads, not only for economic reasons, but also for asserting sovereignty. A well-lit capital is a symbol of governance. A dark province can seem neglected or dangerous. Investing in light was a way to make power legible at night. Still, the technical transition to fuller nocturnal illumination was slow. Big shifts, like the mass production of cleaner, burning fuels, did not happen quickly. Instead, the medieval to early modern centuries are best understood as a longue durée of incremental improvements. Better glass, richer candle supplies, improved ironwork for shutters and hinges, and a slowly professionalizing watch. Combining these incremental advances gradually transformed urban nights. Importantly, rural nights remained different. The countryside continued to rely on hearths, lamps, and human watchfulness for longer periods. The economic calculus of installing extensive street lighting did not make sense in scattered rural settlements. Thus rural cultures continued longer under the older nocturnal logic, where night remained more opaque, and where folk practices, charms, and local rituals maintained larger roles. Another major factor in reconfiguring night was the evolution of legal codes. Over time, the law shifted from localized, discretionary judgments toward more centralized, standardized legal practices. That transformation altered how nocturnal crimes were prosecuted and what constituted admissible evidence. The push for consistent legal standards sometimes mitigated the excesses of rumor-based convictions, but it also introduced bureaucratic complexities that did not always protect the vulnerable. A more formal legal system might demand clearer proof, which could reduce wrongful penalties, but it could also empower officials who now had more instruments, like night warrants and formal surveillance, to control populations. Culturally, the old nocturnal motifs did not vanish. They transformed. Witchcraft accusations, for instance, evolved in the early modern period into larger panics in some regions, partly as a result of changing legal and religious frameworks. The shift from localized suspicion to institutionalized witch hunts in some areas shows how the night remained an elastic metaphor that could be mobilized for political and moral purposes. The means of trial, printing of trial records, publication of sensational pamphlets, sometimes magnified local fears into regional frenzies, but there were also positive cultural stories. Night became a setting for new forms of commerce. Night markets for specific goods, nocturnal workshops for clockmakers and other late-night artisans, and a cultural life that included music and socializing after dark. The expansion of nocturnal commercial life shows how economic incentives reshaped cultural norms. As value could be created at night, motivation grew to make nights safer and more accessible. Parallel to these social transformations were changes in science and philosophy. The 17th century's observational sciences began to reframe how people thought about natural phenomena. Greater understanding of meteorology and of the nature of epidemics gradually reduced the tendency to interpret weather and disease purely as moral or supernatural signs. That change did not eradicate folk belief, but it provided new explanatory frameworks that sometimes tempers nocturnal anxiety. The Enlightenment's growing emphasis on reason and empiricism furthered this reconfiguration, though it too coexisted with deep cultural attachments to older imaginations of the night. Yet technology played perhaps the largest role in changing the lived experience of night. Over centuries, innovations yielded brighter, steadier, and cheaper sources of light. The gradual scaling up of public lighting infrastructure, first in market hubs, later in growing towns and cities, changed how people moved at night. Streets once treacherous became passable. Kinds of night commerce once impossible became feasible. Those material changes restructured social patterns. Nightlife expanded, guilds and authorities adapted, and cultural practices shifted. But even with these improvements, the medieval legacy remained in the form of rituals, stories, and laws that shaped people's expectations about the night. The long-term trajectory shows that while fear of the night diminished in some places and contexts, it also mutated. New fears emerged: the fear of surveillance, the fear of anonymity in expanding cities, the fear of crime carried out in more complex forms. The night became a site of different anxieties. That complexity is crucial to recognize. History rarely replaces one emotion with its opposite. It repatterns it. As we reach the close of this narrative, there is a subtle but important moral. Fear of the night was not a simple superstition to be dismissed. It was grounded in real hazards, predators, poor lighting, fragile structures, and the unpredictability of human behavior. People responded with a rich repertoire of adaptations: technology, law, ritual, and culture. Those adaptations were creative and humane, as often as they were punitive or cruel. The medieval nocturnal world was neither barbaric nor idyllic. It was human, full of resourcefulness, fear, tenderness, and mistake. Now, let us slide toward the more intimate close of our journey. I want you to imagine standing, once again, at a threshold somewhere near the end of the medieval era, when towns were humming with new commerce and the first hints of modernity began to show. The watchman pauses, not only because his duty compels him, but because he is tired and human. A neighbor slips a candle into his hand as thanks. A woman walks past, muffled in a cloak, and the two exchange a weary smile. The night is still night, but it has begun to be threaded with new light. When we look back over the centuries, the persistence of nocturnal fear teaches us something about human adaptation. People invent tools and rules, not only to make life possible, but to make it dignified. Lighting a candle was as much an act of love as it was an act of safety. Holding the watch was not only a duty but a demonstration of solidarity. Legal reforms and technological innovations mattered, yes, but so did the small things. Sharing a brazier, telling a neighbor to sleep in your room for safety, singing a lullaby when the wind moaned outside. Those gestures created the human context in which policy and invention took root. And so, as our narrative winds down, let us breathe slowly and let the impressions settle. We have walked through lanes and courts, sat in inn hearths, watched watchmen stride past, and listened to the slow creak of gates being bolted. We have viewed how fear shapes law, how technology shapes night, and how communities respond with both instruments and care. The medieval relationship with darkness was complex, sometimes cruel, sometimes tender, always adaptive. If you are still awake as this quiet story draws to a close, allow yourself to feel the gradual easing of the narrative's energy. The night has been our teacher in many ways, showing how fear can be managed, how community can be made resilient, and how small acts of light can change the shape of the dark. Take a breath. Release it slowly. Imagine the candle's flame becoming steady and warm. Imagine the watchman's lantern being set down. Imagine, too, that the world outside your own window holds its own small rituals of safety and care. I hope you're feeling a little more peaceful than when we began. Take your time, relax, and let sleep arrive whenever it chooses. If this story brought you some calm, or sparked a thought, please like the video. Subscribe if you enjoy these quiet histories, and leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, or which part of the night in history you found most surprising. I read them, and I always appreciate hearing from you. Thank you for spending this quiet journey with me. Until our next story, this is Thomas, wishing you a peaceful night. Good night.